Hello, welcome. We're doing FDR and the New Deal. All right. I apologize for getting it on so lately. I posted it about 15 minutes ago, and I posted it as well. I posted as well the third test questions pertaining to this subject. All right. So I don't know if you've had a chance to look at them, but I'll be happy to show them as well. All right. So thank you for attending. And I will jump right into it. All right. Unless you have any questions. You have any questions?
Mr. Cowell, I wanted to know, I had trouble logging into the meeting this past Monday. I wasn't
Really?
sure if it started at the same time.
Yes. So yeah, we I plan to always start at 1 o'clock on Mondays to give you ample time during the week to complete the assignment. And so yeah, that's what I intend at least is every Monday at 1 o'clock.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because I tried to log in. I don't know if I was just on the wrong Zoom link, but I went on the one on the Zoom link we always go on at 1.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't begin to know what happened.
Yeah, I
Um,
wasn't sure either. So I was just like, okay. And then I know you commented on one of my assignments if I attended the Zoom, and then I let you know, but I wasn't sure if you got it.
okay, yeah, I need to check up on my Canvas messages, but I will even if I were to correct your paper and fail to do so, let me know by a Canvas message, and I will, especially as you've been present in the past, I will definitely give you the benefit of the doubt and give you your extra points. Okay,
Okay.
I'd be happy
Yeah.
to do that. But yeah, if you would just go to modules and hit the one just at the top of the module page. That's the one that I hit on to meet with you. Okay,
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Cowell.
you're welcome. And just let me know in the future by Canvas messages if you're having issues with that, and I'll see what I could do to rectify it. And like I said, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt anytime that you're not present, and you let me know that you tried.
Okay.
Okay,
That's good.
sounds good. Sounds good to me. Yeah, you deserve that. You've been present. I trust you. All right, and so I'm gonna go ahead and share the screen, just covering the basic legislation of the New Deal, and then I'm going to get into interpretations of the New Deal, and then the assignment itself, as well as the questions pertinent to test 3. Okay, so you see here the New Deal occurred in 1932. There was a big pendulum swing, if you would. The conservative Republicans had both houses during the 20s, as well as the presidency, and Warren G. Harding, and then he died in 23, and Calvin Coolidge took over and was elected from 24 to 28, and then 28 to 32 was Herbert Hoover. And according to, you have to keep in mind that a premise in academia, as academia does tend to favor neoliberalism, bigger government in the capitalist economy, ostensibly for the underdogs. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's important to note, any kind of, leaning in the historiography when you're reading a history book. Academia likes this guy. They like his philosophy, uh, um, especially as it pertains to Keynesian economics, after a guy named John Maynard Keynes, Keynes, or Keynesian economics. Um, he To him, right, that the health of an economy starts from the bottom. It rests on the purchasing power of the average American consumer. As long as the average American has consumer power and is out spending money, that is the first kind of litmus test for a healthy economy. And you could make the argument that from the conservatives, especially as later articulated by Ronald Reagan, it's been kind of decried as trickle down economics, whereby they contend, right, that everything relies upon more laissez-faire principles of the government letting the economy be, don't tax the American people very much, including the wealthy. And as particularly the wealthy, the corporations, et cetera, when they are able to save more money by having, a smaller percentage of it taxed from them, they are able to invest more, are able to ostensibly buy more plants, hire more workers, buy more machinery, spend that extra money in ways that trickle down to the American people. And that is largely criticized in academia. So like I said, know the slant from academia. I think it's important to know the slant from in any science or social science. But it is what it is, and that's what academia tends to do. So academia really tends to uphold, to a certain extent, court history of Franklin Roosevelt, and praising him for his involvement in the economy, especially adding an emotional context to it, not only being philosophically against laissez-faire, government let it be economics, but for his noted compassion, that of him and of his wife, the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, during the Great Depression, that they were almost providentially put in place to show compassion to the people when they needed it so badly during the Great Depression. Remember that during the Great Depression, and there are many arguments for as to what caused the Great Depression, one of the largest problems that ensued was overproduction and underconsumption. A lot of goods were being produced. You look at Henry Ford's automobiles, etc. An automobile coming off the conveyor belt about every 10 seconds. And Americans could no longer buy the automobiles. And so you had cases of people starving, but farmers having produce that they were destroying, that they had excess that no one had the purchasing power to buy. And so it was a really, really sad predicament, seeing all this extra food, all these extra products being produced, and no one had the purchasing power to buy them. And so in comes FDR in 1932, and he pledges generically a New Deal, right? A New Deal that he's gonna bring about. And we're going to get into different interpretations to him and his New Deal, but I want to go over some of the basic legislation that entailed. Firstly, he declared a bank holiday between March 6th and March 11th of 1933 when he first came in, and shut down the banks because there was no trust in the banks. The banks were shutting down by the thousands in 1932 and 1933. And he wanted to restore confidence and also solubility of the banks to be able to stay on their feet. So they shut down the banks, and he gave a famous fireside chat. And he'll be known for these chats, right? He's known for his charisma and his ability to seemingly empathize with the common suffering American during the Great Depression. His communication skills are often lauded by academia. So he gets on the radio and he engages in oftentimes fireside chats were at least twice a month. They became much more typical than that. And he would apprise the people of what he was up to, what his administration was up to. And he would say simple things like, I'm very sorry if you had nothing to feed your children today, but I want you to know that this week we've done such and such. We're talking to Congress, demanding that they do such and such to rectify this problem and that problem, et cetera, et cetera. So his fireside chats seem to have been relatively successful for one reason. I mean, he's elected 4 times. He's our only president to have been such. Was elected 4 times during the Great Depression. He's going to liken the Depression to a war situation, and saying that he is engaging, the administration and the country are engaging in a war against poverty. So at any rate, in this fireside chat, he convinces Americans to put $1 billion back into the banks, convincing them that with the a sticker, a famous sticker on the banks, with the approval and the support of the federal government and the Federal Reserve System. The new banks are safe to invest your money in, and he lets the people know, right, that hey, your deposits don't sit in a as I had thought as a child, that they put it in some kind of box and just kept your financial deposit safely in a safe or something. He said that money is going out in ways that help the economy, in the form of loans and subsidies to businesses, etc. And we need you to do your patriotic duty in putting your money back into the bank. And a lot of his rhetoric is going to be couched in those terms, in the form of cooperation. He uses that term quite often, and patriotism. That it's your patriotic duty to help the country, not just yourself, not just your family, not just your faction of whatever you do for a living, but help the entire country out. And so $1 billion were put back into the banks within weeks. And the newly opened banks, there was a great sense of enhanced confidence in the banking system just from this simple act. But not only that, he took us off the gold standard, and that was huge. He had Congress, a guy who was a bit marginal as a populist, as a congressman. He had it moved through Congress to give the president authority to do such, either to issue fiat spending, just spending just spending new money, and of course that would cause inflation, and the Republicans were looked askance at that, but he didn't care. He saw this as a great emergency. And if we have to, get off the gold standard and be irresponsible in spending ourselves into debt, then so be it. Such was the desire to engage in Keynesian economics, arguably, to get purchasing power back to the average American person, and to get spending and consumption back up with production. So at any rate, he does that. And then his Agricultural Adjustment Act was very radical in the sense that he got the leaders of the different industries together. So whether it's, peaches, whatever your crop was, and he would try to get in alignment production with consumption, and even tamper with prices. And so, the government doing this, planning this, this looked like what was going on in Europe. With the fascist countries like Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, with Italy and Germany, and also with the Soviet Union. And it didn't help also that he put in to his cabinet unofficial assistants, like Ray Moeller and a guy named Rex Tugwell, and these other, quote, radicals who had gone on this expedition to the Soviet Union and through Europe as intellectuals. A lot of them were like Columbia University professors, etc. And they were trying to look at what the fascist and the communist countries of Europe were doing to combat the Great Depression. And yes, they were even praising some of the things they were doing. Now, of course, they didn't want the whole baby with the bathwater. They weren't advocating fascism. They weren't advocating communism per se, but they were saying that some of the things they were doing were quite effective. And so putting these radicals unofficially, notice that he knew that the Senate and the American public probably couldn't stomach putting such radical intellectuals in official cabinet positions. He put them as assistants to his Secretary of the Treasury, his Secretary of State, etc. And so it was kind of a backdoor way of putting in radical men with radical ideas into this administration. And Rex Tugwell will play a big part in the Agricultural Adjustment Act. So the fact that the government now is cooperating with leaders of industries to dictate how much farm produce should be produced in a given year, what the price ought to be, because remember the antitrust laws, the Sherman antitrust law, the Clayton antitrust law, was against price fixing amongst private people, and now the government is cooperating in price fixing and how much of what to be produced. This was seen as radical, right? This was a radical intrusion into the capitalist economy. And in fact, they were paying people to switch crops. They were paying people to stop farming. And that was a radical notion, right? This AAA. And so, but nevertheless, they got it through another name. The Supreme Court is actually going to shut it down, strike it down as unconstitutional, and they're going to rename it the Soil Conservation Act. And with good lawyers, do words on play and say no, that we're just we're subsidizing people to conserve soil and nutrients and so forth, and they're able to get it through under another name. And so this is, some of this is pretty radically novel under the New Deal. And then the Civilian Conservation Corps, this is playing with the idea of hiring 250,000 young men to engage in forestry work. And so, oftentimes with public works before, you always had a private middleman, right? You would hire a private middleman to engage in public works of some sort, and so that it's private companies hiring construction crews and paying them what they want to pay them, being subsidized by the federal government. But now it's the federal government directly putting young men into military uniforms, of all things, putting them having military, paraphernalia. They were in tents. They would blow the bugle in the morning and have meals for them that the federal government is paying for and paying them. And they even, according to our textbook of Alan Brinkley, right, at one point mandated that the young men could only keep about a third of their salaries, and the rest of their salaries had to go back home to their families, again, to give purchasing power to their families so that they could spend money and get the wheels going, so to speak, economically. So, when you looked at this smacked of like the brown shirts of Germany and the black shirts of Italy. And so some people saw this as like a fascist-like device of public works programs. All right. And especially that there was a lot of military-oriented, facets to it that didn't make the image of it any better. But he went ahead and went with it and got it passed in the first 100-day session, where he called Congress in an emergency session. The beginnings of the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act is whereby brokers and middlemen in the stock market in particular would be held accountable for their actions. They would have to give honest statements first to the Federal Trade Commission. Then they would establish a Securities and Exchange Commission at the SEC. And the SEC would serve as the policeman, if you would, of the stock market. So now there's putting great supervision, federal supervision over the stock market, because of course the fall of the stock market in October of 29 was not the cause, but it was very instrumental part of the Great Depression. And so this was actually rather popular because there was a lot of anti-Wall Street sentiment at this time, anti-banking sentiment. And so, but these are some radical acts that are going on. And then the beginnings of the Tennessee Valley Authority, that's whereby the government retained World War I work industry production of hydroelectric power. And instead of selling or leasing that hydroelectric plant to a private company, there was a guy named Insull and others who had lots of, during the 20s, some with like PG&E, some great scandals. Instead of putting it to a middleman, which was the traditional thing to do in a capitalist country, a private hydroelectric company, the federal government retained it and created this hydroelectric power and then subsidized it to the poor people of Alabama and in the South. They saw what people they thought in given regions could afford for electric power, and the federal government helped subsidize that cost. So this is flirting, arguably with gas and water socialism. The idea, right, that certain industries like access to water and electricity, et cetera, ought to be separated from the capitalist system and ought to be considered a right rather than a privilege, as with other commodities and services and so forth in the capitalist economy, that instead of being by merit, what you can afford, it was considered a right, and the government is going to help ensure that everyone could have access to it. So again, kind of flirting with gas and water socialism, we're seeing some radical changes here in the New Deal. And then the National Industrial Recovery Act was in some ways similar to the Agricultural Adjustment Act with the farmers, is they started to put together almost like medieval-like guilds and produce codes. Again, the main problem being overproduction and underconsumption in a lot of the major industries. And so now they're going to help dictate production. They're going to help dictate prices for the goods, the government in cooperation with the leading industries and in the private industrial producers. And they're even going to mandate under the Wagner Act a code, I think it was 7A, a minimum wage, so that they cannot just lay off their workers. They have to pay them a certain minimum wage. And this was new, here at the national level, to have a minimum wage law. And so the National Industrial Recovery Act, again, was couched in terms of patriotism, that if you didn't have that eagle contending that you were cooperating with the government and doing your part and coming to terms with wages for your workers, hours guaranteed to your workers, and how much in productivity and even prices that you would sell your product at, you were to be shunned by the public. And you, of course, could not receive any kind of subsidies from the federal government. So a lot of this stuff, right, really, you can see some similarities in the fascist and communist countries of Europe taking on the Great Depression. So that's why, just in some accounts, FDR is seen as a radical ideologue, a guy who had a radical vision, and people differed, right, from case to case on whether he was very far to the right or very far to the left. Most often, because of the opposition to the Republican Party, he was perceived as being radically to the left. But you see some novel changes here going on. All right. And then you also have the Works Progress Administration. At any given time, according to our textbook of Alan Brinkley's, the federal government began to directly employ 2.5 million Americans to do public works and other things, to engage in work. And so now the federal government is taking the job of directly employing millions of American people. And you look at some of the projects that they had, they really went out of their way to employ a broad array of people of different backgrounds and interests and talents. They had a federal writers project, a federal theater project. We're not just talking about roads and sports stadiums and bridges, et cetera. We're talking about a broad array of works, engaging in poetry writing and sculpture creation and all kinds of different things. But so the WPA was the singularly largest employment agency of the federal government. And so again, the government is taking responsibility for trying to provide purchasing power directly to the common man. This Keynesian or Keynesian economic philosophy seems to undergird it. And the Social Security Act, which you're familiar with, was put into effect. So age-old pensions to be paid by American people and to so that they can get that back at retirement age. But that included the beginnings of what would become later Medicare also, the origins of helping disabled people and pregnant single young women and other demographics became very quickly eligible to receive Social Security checks as well. All right. And then the Fraser-Lemke Act, which was shot down by the Supreme Court, this offered a 5-year moratorium, and it was changed to 3 years, a 5-year moratorium on farm, what's the word? Where they come and take your farm for lack of mortgage payments. And under the Fraser-Lemke Act, as long as it lasted, supposedly, according to one source that I had read, up to over a quarter of farmers were able to regain their farms, getting this, having this extra time and a second chance at their mortgage payments. Foreclosure was a name I couldn't think of. And so you see some radical things here with the New Deal. And so interpretations, I want to stop sharing this and I want to go to my notes here. All right. So let's see here. So one, right, like I think H.W. Brands kind of adheres to, is that FDR and his administration were courageous, idealistic, radical ideologues, that they had a grand, somewhat leftist vision for the economic system and for the country, to really push us to the left on the political spectrum, to try to engage in a lot more direct government planning and participation in the capitalist system. But of course, always ostensibly for the common person, for the common farmer, common laborer, common consumer, etc. So again, Keynesian economics, you engage in deficit spending, you engage in money that you don't really have, right, to get further into debt in the long run, but to ensure the purchasing power of the common American by providing jobs, by putting up codes in farming and industry to ensure, amongst other things, affordable prices for goods and minimum wages for workers. All right. So like I said, in his informal cabinet, you have Ray Moley and Rex Tugwell and others, right? Felix Frankfurter, a judge, who were pretty radical in their writings. He had them informally placed in his cabinet and was oftentimes asking for their advice and insisting that the actual cabinet members come to terms with these informal, quote, assistants before something could be passed. All right. And so according to chapter 26 of Traitor to His Class by H.W. Brands, I have here, no more laissez-faire magician, no more waiting for a magician to solve the problems of the economy and to get us out of this depression, but direct government participation, involvement, and cooperation with the private industries, right, to ensure decency and economic security, which he said were the rights of all American people. And so that does seem to show evidence of a paradigm shift in politics, in American political tradition, with FDR, of contending that, hey, the government needs to get involved to ensure the basic necessities of the American people. As long as people are willing to work, he said, right, there ought to be guaranteed employment for them. There ought to be guaranteed minimum wages for subsistence, just to be able to pay their bills and to eat and so forth. And there ought to be a healthy balance between production and consumption. and the government needs to ensure that that happens. So much bigger government now. This is a big change in that, in our historical, evolution. Then people like William Leuchtenberg say, you know what? I don't see an ideologue here. I see a pragmatist. I see a guy who didn't know what he was doing. He said, first of all, look at his 1932 presidential candidacy speeches. He was all over the place. Yes, in places like Topeka, Kansas, and in Atlanta, Georgia, he did talk about having a more planned economy, and heavily hinted that there would be more government intervention in the economy should he be elected. But at the same time, he also at other places, like in Iowa and other places, said that he was going to not engage in deficit spending, that he was going to be engaged in very strict and responsible financial manner, that he would keep the budget and not engage in too much spending. Well, how do you do that, right? How do you have the government subsidize all these industries, directly employ and pay wages to millions of American people without spending more money? But of course, we know in hindsight, he didn't. He engaged in deficit spending. He took us off the gold standard and engaged in fiat spending. So at any rate, and then also his MO with official and unofficial cabinet members. To Leuchtenberg, he said, no, I don't think it was so much that these guys were radicals, people like Ray Moley and Rex Tugwell, that impressed him so much. It just impressed him that they were so intelligent, and that he deliberately put in pretty conservative people actually into his cabinet. Henry Wallace in agriculture and others, etc., that they weren't radical. And because he wasn't radical, he wanted to put together kind of, conservatives and more leftists, and he wanted to see them kind of debate things out in front of him. And matter of fact, he would have these famous dinners where he would have his unofficial radical cabinet members and his official conservative members have debate in front of him. And to a lot of people, this was a torturous event because just for the very nature of debate. But supposedly Franklin Roosevelt loved it, and he was trying to pick and choose ideas that he thought made better sense between the two sides, and so that he wasn't necessarily to the left nor necessarily to the right. He just knew that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. He knew that the Republican Party from 28 to 32 under Hoover did not do enough, and were expecting this magician, he said, this invisible magician of the market to get us out of the Great Depression. And he saw clearly that had not worked. So he thought, try something, for God's sake, try something. That's kind of almost a direct quote of Franklin Roosevelt. And so to Leuchtenberg, he said, this guy really didn't know where he stood. He was a pragmatist. He was a practical guy who was wanting to engage in trial and error improvisation to see what worked and what didn't. And also, I might like to add to this is, I have here his use of the press conferences. They said he was just very wily with the press. He would have Wednesdays and Fridays, he would have press conferences, and he would ask the members of the press almost as many questions as they had of him, trying to gauge where public opinion was on a given subject. He would when he was tinkering with an idea, his administration, he would first ask the members of the press what they thought. And when things were seen to be too radical, oftentimes he would step back and think, okay, the country's not ready for that. And so, and he would put the brakes on that particular project. And so you definitely see in Leuchtenberg's book a much less idealistic guy, but just a practical, almost typical politician who knew something needed to be done. And so he's going to tinker with this idea, then that idea, then this idea, then that idea, to deal with these tangible problems and just kind of see what might work, what was palatable to the American people, what they were willing to imbibe and accept. And so it's something to think about with another interpretation to him. And then other people see more cynically a demagogue, his calling of special congressional meetings, his threats when Congress didn't cooperate with him to go directly to the people by way of his fireside chats and his speaking engagements, etc. They see a manipulative, strong-arming executive who's trying to get the Congress to grant more and more latitude to his executive department. I mean, because really, when you think about it, his National Industrial Recovery Act, and the NRA, directly cooperating with the leaders of industries and fixing prices and wages and production levels, etc. Right? The executive hadn't done that before. Doing the same thing with the farmers, right? With the Agricultural Adjustment Act, employing millions of Americans with the WPA and the CCC. He definitely enlarged the scope of the executive department of the federal government. I think that is inarguable. And he was getting Congress to do this. And he was, of course, likening to Congress the Great Depression to a state of war, and saying that he needs almost emergency wartime powers as their president to get them out of this Great Depression. So some people see a demagogue, and a demagogue, right, is a manipulator of the people who has his own agenda, who has his own power and following that he secretly has in mind. But he knows the popular dictums, the popular things to say, the popular issues that people are wanting to be resolved, and he capitalizes on that and saying, "Hey, I'm one of you. I'm one of the common people." But of course, we know FDR was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He was from old Hyde Park wealth of New York, and so again, he was elected 4 times. He ran for president 4 times. And so that's something to think about. And then also when the Supreme Court began shooting down his administration's decrees, he tried to pack the court. He tried to increase it from 9 to 13 men. So of course he could put 4 yes men in the Supreme Court so he can get a majority of 7 to try to pass and approve of everything his New Deal was entailing. And of course, the fact that he was saying that some of the Supreme Court justices were elderly and sickly, and that it was just to help the workload. No one really in the country bought that, this court packing attempt. So he really flexed his muscles in trying to go directly to the people and trying to strong arm Congress and strong arm the Supreme Court into cooperating with his New Deal. And that's something to think about. And then others like Howard Zinn say this guy was not a radical. I mean, look what he did ultimately. He saved capitalism. He bailed out the banks. He gave a sense of accountability to the stock market, but he kept the stock market intact. He cooperated with big businesses and big farms. For instance, with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, they subsidized the big farmers and paying them to switch crops or to not grow as much, etc. Right? But what about the tenant farmers? They were the average Americans, not the farm owners, but the tenant farmers. They didn't receive these subsidies. Their farm owners did. So the farm owners, the rich farm owners, they get the subsidies to switch crops or to stop farming momentarily. And they just kicked the tenants off and said, sorry, I'm getting paid not to farm. Or I'm getting paid to switch from, peaches to grapes or something. And I don't need as many of you. And so they just kicked them off. And so like in Arkansas and Oklahoma and other regions, the tenant farmers organized in these groups and demanded that they receive subsidies because they were getting the shaft. And FDR refused to help them, said that they were too radical, etc. And so also you look at a guy named Huey Long, and Franklin Roosevelt called him the second behind Douglas MacArthur, a military, almost wannabe dictator. Um, Behind Douglas MacArthur alone, the second most dangerous man in the country. So clearly, right, with ideas of sharing wealth, he didn't abide by that. He saw Huey Long as a nuisance and a danger to the country, not as an ally and fellow leftist radical. And of course, the official Communist Party and Socialist Party he gave no support to, etc. And so, to Howard Zinn, this guy was secretly a conservative. He wanted to conserve the capitalist economy, and he knew to do so it required some fundamental changes and some adaptations of government intervention to save it. But in the end, he wanted to do just that, save it, and not become a fascist country, not become a communist country, as the direction was going in places in Europe. All right. So let me switch and go to the handout itself. All right. Let's see here. Show all windows. I hope I have it. Darn it. Shoot, the assignment itself, I don't have it opened. Darn it. All right, so what I want to do is I want to go off of memory and then also look at the test. All right, the first 5 questions of the test that are pertinent to this topic. So first of all, right, you're going to see a paragraph, or more than a paragraph, but a section, an argumentative section that is going to try to convey the image of him being a radical ideologue. All right. And it's going to stress things like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the WPA, right, the TVA, flirting with gas and water socialism, to try to demonstrate that he was kind of a radical president with a radical vision of change, of fundamentally altering our capitalist system. All right. So you'll see the first section on that. The second section is some great man kind of sentimental history. Is you're going to see evidence of him being changed as a man by contracting polio, and by way of his marriage to Eleanor Roosevelt, and becoming a much more compassionate, kind human being. And it almost being, fate that he suffered polio and that he married Eleanor so that he could be prepared to be this compassionate patriarch over the country during the New Deal. And so look for that in the section number 2, and look for evidence of him just gaining a humanitarian sense of empathy to put himself in the shoes of those who are suffering. And look at a lot of praise of Eleanor. Eleanor had a lot of depth to her. She was brought up into the progressive tradition by her aunt, and in her education and her family, and her uncle Teddy, right, as the progressive Teddy Roosevelt, and so forth. She was involved in settlement house projects. She visited Europe and saw how the Salvation Army was engaging in philanthropic works, etc. And there's an interesting book called Letters to Eleanor, in which it shows a lot of American citizens, common American citizens, wrote to her, and she was kind of, like an Oprah Winfrey of her generation. People looked to her as this matriarch who was kind and benevolent and wanted to help extract people from their miserable situations. And so you had people writing and asking her for food, for bicycles, for an adopted baby sister, I kid you not, and things like that. And she wrote back faithfully to thousands upon thousands of letter writers, etc. And so that she had that effect on Franklin Roosevelt, despite the unconventional, for lack of a better adjective, strange dynamic of her marriage to Franklin Roosevelt. They were oftentimes separated and stopped living with one another for years when he began the presidency. He had his unfaithful affairs. She had a dear female friend, and so it was very unconventional marriage, but supposedly she was able to extract a lot of depth from Franklin and conviction to do the right thing and to use his office for good for the common suffering American during the Great Depression. All right. Then you'll find a section of William Leuchtenberg kind of summing up his book. And so you're going to look for evidence of him not necessarily having a platform, not necessarily having a definitive ideology, but being kind of a practical politician, of engaging in, trial and error experimentation to see, whose idea might work the best, this informal cabinet member on the left or this formal cabinet member's idea to the right, in tackling these big issues that they were faced with during the Great Depression. So Leuchtenberg, look for that thesis on that section, and I believe it's a third section. Then the fourth section, I try to just play, and I wrote a big caveat to it. Okay, pretty much stating that I personally don't adhere to that thesis, but I thought it was very thought provoking, and it's the idea that Franklin Roosevelt and the American administration knew full well that an attack was coming, very likely even knew days before that it was coming on the precise area of the naval installations at Pearl Harbor, and deliberately did nothing to thwart it, so that they could get a sense of public outrage and American sentiment to change from isolationism, wanting to stay out of World War II, to wanting to help the Allies, because the Allies were in desperate straits at that time, particularly England, trying to fight Nazi Germany. And so, like I said, I just thought there was enough of that thesis to be thought-provoking to throw that in as number 4. All right. So you look at these, right? Court history of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal praises his evolution into a benevolent, paternalistic ruler via experiences with polio and his relationship with his wife, Eleanor. Yes, section number 2 does just that. The following New Deal programs were depicted by the instructor as arguably radical for the federal government to initiate them during the 30s, which option does not fit. So I mentioned the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, right, with hydroelectric power and subsidizing hydroelectric power to the poor Southern people. The WPA is a massive works project administration. The AAA as the federal government subsidizing and coordinating with farmers on production levels and crop choices, etc. William Leuchtenberg's depiction of Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal was that he was a pragmatist, right, and not an ideologue. Which of the following is false regarding class coverage of Franklin Roosevelt? According to H.W. Brands, Franklin Roosevelt was consistently and philosophically against laissez-faire principles in favor of a planned economy. Yes, H.W. Brands, I believe, goes that far on more than one occasion in his book, A Traitor to His Class. Franklin Roosevelt's placement of his somewhat radical and formal cabinet arguably demonstrated a willingness to tamper with novel ideas. Yes, I did make that subjective claim, as well as H.W. Brands. Franklin Roosevelt arguably broadened the scope of executive leadership and involvement in the economy. Absolutely. No matter what your interpretation of him is, I think you have to agree with C. Roosevelt's call to industrial cooperation, in spite of American political tradition of antitrust laws, under the slogan of patriotism in time of virtual war, was quite controversial. Absolutely. And you see that with the National Industrial Recovery Administration and Act. Roosevelt challenged traditional notions of meritocracy via his national dole system. No, he didn't initiate a dole system. That was a little bit too far for him to stomach, the idea of just giving money out to the American people. He wanted them to have a sense of psychological and emotional enrichment and being able to, something as small and symbolic as a uniform. Most of his work projects, there was a uniform involved. He wanted people to get up in the morning, put on a uniform, and work for their money, to give them a sense, get out of that malaise that they were suffering during the Great Depression. And he thought that was the dole was too far for the Republicans and the conservatives to stomach. All right. Franklin Roosevelt could be portrayed as at least moderately conservative in that he salvaged the capitalist system and opposed far left and right wing politicians and movement. Yes, I would say yes to that one as well. All right. So are there any questions about Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal questions that you'll have on test 3, or the sections, the argumentative theses that you have on this assignment?
I have no questions.
All right, Alyssa, thank you so much for hanging in there. I'm going to give you 10 rather than 5 points. So I appreciate that. And you have a good week, okay?
Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. You too.
All right, take care, okay, hon? Thank you for coming.